All right, let's start at the beginning. What is your origin story? Tell us about your childhood. Tell us about kind of where you have come from. What has formed you from the beginning?
Hey, everybody. I grew up in kind of North Sydney in the Hills area. Both of my parents are Egyptian, so they both came from Cairo kind of separately, and they ended up meeting and falling in love here. My dad is a computer engineer and my mum is a doctor. She studied her first year of medicine in Egypt and then came here and completed her studies at the University of Sydney. And that kind of transition was a kind of interesting and challenging time for her, but she got through it, and both of my parents ended up settling here. They probably met a couple of years after my mum ended up finishing her studies and had me pretty soon afterwards, and then my sister a few years later. And we're lucky when my mum came especially, she was basically the only person in her family. Her and her brother were the only ones here, and now we have our extended family around us as well, which is really lovely. Grew up in the Hills area. We were part of a Coptic Orthodox church a little while away, but kind of a big, bustling cultural centre as much as it is a religious community. And I also went to a Anglican school growing up from kindergarten to year 12, and that kind of formed a lot of my faith journey.
So you mentioned growing up in the Coptic tradition, which is a part of your family heritage and your cultural heritage. What did you love about that world growing up, and what did you struggle with?
So growing up, a lot of the services, we went to quite a traditional Orthodox church, so a lot of the services were either in Arabic or Coptic. So I didn't really understand much, but it just meant that kind of experiencing church, especially because it's very heavily liturgical and it usually runs for 2 hours if you're lucky, and then sometimes a lot longer. So even not understanding the words, you kind of had this beautiful sense of kind of having the liturgy wash over you, and kind of experiencing that. And it's a really lovely, amazing thing. It was interesting because we would go every once in a while, we would try to be regular, and then inevitably we would not show up for a while, and then we would try to be regular again. So I never really set down my roots in that community. And then as I got older and I kind of started learning about, when I was about 14, I read this blog post by an author I really loved and suddenly discovered that sexism existed. It was quite a shock, mainly because I consider my household to kind of be a matriarchy. My mum is definitely in charge, and being at an Anglican girls' school, a lot of the leadership positions were held by women, so I hadn't really put together that sexism was really a thing. And kind of reading that blog post, it started with a story of violence, and then it continued on to explore other issues, and it was just like, this is the way that the world is structured. And the thing about the community that I grew up in is that women don't really participate in leadership roles in the church. So you would not have a radica in a Orthodox community. Doesn't make any sense. And so it was one of those things where I remember just trying to start processing that, and just realizing that wasn't a context that I wanted to continue in. And then also, along that journey of learning more about feminism and the church, I also became affirming, and I was like, okay, so this really isn't the place for me.
So reading the blog post and starting that kind of epiphany process, was there a sense of anger at recognising sexism that exists in and beyond the church? Was there a sense of anger that was in you, or was there just a sense of, this just doesn't fit for me? Like, what was it? What was your feeling around that?
Yeah, I think it was more of a gradual process, so I don't know that I felt a strong sense of anger. In the Orthodox community, it really prides itself on this sense of the idea that we're carrying on the traditions of, generations and generations and generations ago, and not changing the faith from the original church fathers. So it almost felt like there was this sense of inevitability, but by the same token, that felt deeply dissatisfying, because to justify that, you kind of need to accept some very almost pat on the head answers, which I knew I wasn't going to be satisfied with. And especially with some of the issues I really care about, especially violence against women, I just really strongly feel like if you don't have women in leadership and women doing theology, we can't address those issues within the church. And so it was just, for me, that's kind of a make or break issue.
So it sounds like that moment at 14 where that kind of dawned on you, either instantly or over a period of time, kind of set the course for the years that were to come, given your current role and the study that you've done. Tell us a little bit about that. What do you do at the moment?
Yeah, that moment is really funny because it changed my entire life. Like, basically every single thing in my life goes back to that one moment. So yeah, I spent kind of those years between 14 and graduating high school just like learning as much as I could, basically online, both about women's rights in general and then also in the context of the church and Christianity. And then by the time I graduated, I was like just ready to get out there and see what was going on. So I started volunteering with a group of young women who did fundraising work for UN Women Australia, which was a really amazing experience over a number of years. And then when I started my first job, which was with a international development charity, I knew that I really wanted to keep on volunteering, and so I decided to join Girl Guides Australia as a Girl Guide leader. And I've been doing that for about 4 years now. And it's just a really awesome, exciting way to engage in the community. So the age group I work with is actually around 14 to 17. So it's also that kind of critical age that I was when things were just starting to explode in my brain. And in a similar way, like, all of these girls are so switched on and so engaged in the world, and it's really amazing. And then just under 3 years ago now, I started my current job, which is doing communications and fundraising work with a charity that mainly provides counselling for people who've experienced sexual and domestic violence. And yeah, that's also been an incredible few years working in that space.
That's amazing work. I imagine very heavy work. Do you ever feel a sense of despair at the fact that domestic violence is, some would say, rampant? What fuels you to keep going in what is a fairly heavy workspace?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I find, like, even just a number of weeks ago now, I was feeling really despondent, not just because, these issues are so rampant, but I felt like I was hearing news story after news story of essentially people and communities who didn't care about holding perpetrators accountable. A lot of them were in the context of sexual violence. And it becomes one of those things where you feel like you're kind of shouting into a void, and, as much progress as we are making, the community as a whole isn't responding in a way that helps prevent and stop this from happening. And so it's interesting. Thank you so much, Curtis, for that little note at the beginning of the first reading, because I think that was really valuable. It's a really tough one, but for me, there's like a kernel in there which holds the kind of hope that keeps me going. I think it's really important when we talk about that passage, because we kind of, it's kind of sanitized in this Sunday school way. Like, you learn it as a child and you don't realise that, like, the extent of the violence that's being described in that passage. I think of it as a bit of a Handmaid's Tale situation, really. When you think about what is actually happening in that situation, there's sexual and reproductive violence and exploitation happening there. I remember reading that passage again, I think it was probably for the first time as an adult, actually, and getting towards the end, and the translation that I was reading, Hagar says towards the end, "I've seen the God who sees me." And for me, that's kind of like this, it just kind of stunned me, because when we talk about sexual violence and about domestic violence, often it happens in the context of two people, and there's usually not anybody around to witness it. And that's why accountability and justice are often so hard for survivors to achieve. So it's really powerful to know that God sees what's happened, and if God sees it, that means that God can bring justice.
It sounds too like your work is fueled by your identity as a feminist, quite passionately so. I can't think of how to ask. Like, I'm kind of want to ask, why are you a feminist? Though that sounds silly. What does feminism mean for you, and what does it mean in the context of being a Christian?
Just an easy question. For me, being a feminist means fighting and advocating for the rights of people of all genders to live in safety and freedom and equality. And being a Christian feminist in particular, for me that's kind of two-pronged. For me that couples very beautifully with the call that Jesus has given us to work with the poor and the oppressed. And then equally, I think that means that, especially in a church that has a history of not only patriarchy, but also not necessarily knowing how to respond to things like interpersonal violence and abuse, actually working to address those things in a systematic way, whether that's putting more women in leadership, whether that's reforming our theology to better address those issues. That's for me, those two elements of it.
I didn't ask you this morning, but are there particular writers or public figures that you are drawn to in terms of theology or feminist thinking that you want to recommend? Recommended reading list, here we go.
Oh my gosh, this is a very funny question to ask. Not funny in the sense of unusual. If you know me, you know I love reading, and so this is
let's say top like 5.
A cool question to spring, I would say. A book I was thinking of in the lead up to this, because we had the Hagar reading, one of the very first books of Black feminist theology is a book called Sisters in the Wilderness by Dolores Williams, and it's all about Hagar's story, and she talks really powerfully about it, and she unravels some of those really tricky complexities of how we deal with that story. And I don't think there's ever going to be like a tidy answer in terms of just feeling like, yes, the story is fine now. But I think that book does a really great job of untangling some of those questions. I really like Elizabeth Johnson. So I think in terms of just something that's more general and accessible, Quest for the Living God is great, and she goes into different systems of liberation theologies essentially, and it's just really, really excellent. And I read She Who Is late last year, which is all about how essentially understanding God as feminine, and explores a lot of different pieces of that. Yes, I should mention the T-shirt. The T-shirt says, "Trust God, she will provide," and I really like it. And it's funny because there were parts of that book, like it's quite long, it's quite academic, it's quite lengthy, but even when I was like getting bored of the overall point that she was making, she talks about the gospel so beautifully that it almost didn't matter. I'd recommend those two as a starting point.
You talked a little about the Genesis reading that was read. The other passage that you chose was Mary, that she was going to birth Jesus, and her response to that. Why is that an important passage for you?
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about growing up in the church, and I think potentially a lot of that is being in a middle-class context where you get taught, like, following God is really important, and God says to obey and honour your mother and your father, and therefore these are the main things away from this. And in a similar way, as a woman within the church, Mary can get held up as, like, God gave her this really hard thing to do in her context, and she obeyed because God is God, and she knew that she had to be obedient to him. And what I love about the way that Luke unpacks this story is that I feel like that completely is just not the frame that Luke is working from, and I don't know how you can read with that frame when you read Luke's description of what happened. The thing that's really powerful to me about the passage that we read was Mary isn't just obeying because God is God, although that is true. She has a really profound and deep sense of what God is doing in the world, and when God calls her to be a part of that, she accepts that call. It's not blind obedience, it's this just kind of radical vision that she knows that she wants to be a part of. And I think the description of that is really powerful, and I think, again, in that kind of, with that gendered lens, it can be presented to us as like, Mary's job was to have Jesus, and that's childbirth, and that's like a very feminine role. But I think that kind of core idea of God is doing these really important things in the world for love and for justice, and we need to come along and be a part of that and listen to God's call in our lives. I think that transcends gender, and that transcends just the vocation of childbirth.
It's a sermon right there. Yeah, that's right. How did you come to be a member of this community? Tell us about what drew you into this space.
So way back when, in 2011, I started uni, and as part of that, I joined Christian Students Uniting, the Bible study on the University of Sydney campus. I was a big nerd, so before I even got there, I made a list of like all my preferences and the various unis that I was interested in, and I was like, okay, if I ended up at this uni, I'd go to this Bible study. If I'd ended up at this uni, I'd go to this Bible study. Yeah, I found one other person who's done that, like, and found CSU that way, and everybody else is like, yeah, I just kind of rocked up. But yeah, so I was at CSU between 2011 and like early 2015, while I was still studying and before I started full-time work. And then after that, I was working, and I would occasionally pop into Luck because I still had lots of friends and connections here. But it was kind of hard to come regularly because I was still living in the hills with my parents, and coming back from evening service via public transport was a trek. And then I actually forgot about this story until I was preparing for this, but at School of Discipleship last year, one David Barrow sat across the lunch table from me and basically looked at me and said, Christina, we're about to get a new minister at Leichhardt Uniting Church. It was still a very big secret that it was Rads and Adrian, so no plural words whatsoever. We're about to get a new minister. It's going to be amazing. The church is going to be doing really exciting things. You want to get in on the ground floor. And I was like, yes. Like, I've been thinking about this. I have been thinking that I wanted to, come to Luck more regularly. And because I was still in the hills, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try and come to morning service because public transport will be easier. Funnily enough, a part of that conversation was David was like very convinced that I should learn to drive to like facilitate coming to church more regularly. And instead, just a few months later, I ended up moving in with him because that was easier. And then I've been here since around mid last year. And it's really interesting because about maybe 5 months of that was without any ministers. And so morning service in particular was very, very quiet. There were some days where, you'd have to convince yourself to get out of bed, and then you'd rock up and I'd be like the fourth person through the door, and then there were no more people coming. So kind of having that sense of oh, like I need to be showing up to this thing because otherwise we won't have another person to do a reading or prayer of confession or whatever it was. Kind of instills that sense of, communal responsibility in you quite early. So, yeah.
And apart from David, putting the hard word on you, why are you here? What do you love about this space? Why have you chosen this to be your home?
Oh my gosh, I love everything about this space. I think for me, first and foremost, the people and the community that we have here is really, really special. And it just kind of astounds me. The group of people that we have here, I think we're really lucky to have people who not only are diverse but have hearts for God's justice in the world. And I think also it's really interesting because being in the church for that little while that we didn't have a minister, the fact that everybody was so passionate what luck is going throughout that time, that commitment was just really extraordinary to see. And then now that we have Rads and Adrian, which is amazing, it's so exciting to have kind of that additional capacity to continue to grow and evolve, to develop who we are as a community.
I'm going to skip to my last question, if that's okay. This is the question that we traditionally ask everyone who is interviewed in this way, and then I'll flick to anyone else who wants to pose a question. So, traditional question: if today you had the opportunity to meet God face to face, what would you say? What would you ask?
So I was originally really worried about this question because I was like, who even knows what is happening? But then I thought about it a little bit. I think I was lying in bed early one morning and I was like, oh, I know what would happen. I would get to heaven, having, died, literally. And I would see God face to face and I'd be like, okay, great. So what, how are we fixing everything? What are we doing? How do we make this work? Clearly Earth is a mess. What do we need to do? And I think that God would look at me and tell me to calm down and it's my time to rest. So, yeah.